a very common hacking technique you can use is to hijack a session. So let's talk about that. There are different types of session hijacking, and we have some objectives that you can understand the various hijacking concepts. You can understand session hijacking at the app level and at the network level, and you'll understand various techniques and use it in penetration testing. So we're going to talk about the concepts, browser session hijacking, client-side attacks, session hijacking at the network level, the various tools, countermeasures, and using it in pen testing. Starting with concepts. The whole idea of hijacking is my victim has already logged on. They've already started a legitimate session, and I managed to take it over. It's not that I'm inserting myself in the middle. I'm taking over their existing session. So I can gain access because the authentication has already happened. Because authentication, of course, happens at the beginning of a TCP session. Once I have access, then I can do whatever that user could have done. But of course, I'll do it with malicious purpose. So I sniff all traffic during the session. I perform malicious acts. And I present myself to the server by stealing somebody's legitimate session ID, and so it looks like I'm also legitimate. So this is how I authenticate, by stealing someone else's session ID. Why is it possible for session hijacking to happen? Well, there are a number of reasons. Here are some of the most common. For one thing, if there is an invalid session ID, like it expires, then the account stays open and it's not locked out. So there's perhaps a lack of an account lockout policy or an account lockout mechanism when a session ID becomes invalid, if it expires or something else happens to it. Or there's no actual expiration time set. So the session can just go on forever. It's indefinite. Or the session IDs are very small and they're predictable or easy to crack or easy to grab. Or the algorithm that generates them is weak. And we're going to talk more about session IDs in just a moment. And this is pretty much, this is a vulnerability on just about any TCP/IP device. Maybe the session IDs aren't handled very well. Maybe they're just in clear text in the URL or easily sniffed. The problem is that to protect something like this, which is basically authentication, you really need to incorporate encryption, and many application developers do not do that. So how can we hijack a session? Well, there are three main approaches. We can either flat out steal the session ID, and there are a variety of techniques which we'll see. We could guess what the session ID is going to be. So realize that the session ID is kind of like a temporary login. It's a temporary username and password, so to speak, but it's not in a classic sense username and password. It's a string that represents that particular session. So we could steal it, and sniffing would be one way. We could just guess. We see them, like maybe the session IDs are starting with 001, then 002, then 003, and we go, aha, the next one's got to be 004. So we look at the parts of the session ID that are incrementing or changing, and we try to guess what a future one would be so we can use it. Or we could just keep on trying different ones until we find one that actually works. We could brute force it. Different things we can do here. We could, to just have our session hijacking, we could inject commands. So we could just start injecting our own packets into the target server. We could take over an existing session, doing session ID prediction. We could make a client basically desynchronize or break their connection so that we can then slip ourselves in. We could just keep track of how the packets are flowing and predict the sequence number of the sessions. Like I said, they come along 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, let's grab 5. Or we could just, well, and we probably will sniff to see what is going on between the victim, the client, and the target server. And in order to hijack a session, we need to gain access somehow to a session that's active. So like maybe there's a machine that is left unattended. Maybe the user has stepped away and we just simply sit down. Or maybe we've got a remote access Trojan in the background and we can just make a connection that way. Or maybe the session has no logout or expiration time and the user did not log out properly. And so we just access the machine when they're away. Now, let's understand the difference between hijacking and spoofing. In hijacking, you are taking over a legitimate active session. You need originally an actual user, a legitimate user, to start the connection, to authenticate to the server. In spoofing, you don't take over someone else's session. You initiate your own session, but by using somebody's stolen credentials. So you pretend to be a user or a machine to gain access. So hijacking is not the same as spoofing. Hijacking means I take over someone else's legitimate session. Spoofing means I start a session using stolen credentials. And I don't take over somebody else's session. So with that little background, let's move on to the next topic.